Good afternoon, all. All right, it's always challenging when you're the last speaker before lunch, so I'll try to make this short and spicy. Ministers, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to be here on behalf of the Prime Contact, who unfortunately was not able to make this afternoon's proceedings. And on behalf of the NAMLAC, which is the National Anti-Money Laundering Committee, and the Bank of Jamaica. This session will provide some context into the shortcomings highlighted in Jamaica's 2017 Mutual Evaluation Report and our consequent greylisting. I like to say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And certainly Jamaica's greylisting presented existential crisis for Jamaica, and I do not believe that we wasted that opportunity. Present continuous, we are wasting the opportunity. Correction. The work done so far to address the gaps in our framework and our subsequent removal from that grey list, and then some lessons learned from the process. The work we're doing to strengthen Jamaica's AML, CFT, and CPF architecture to avoid a return to the FATF and the FATF enhanced follow-up processes. So just a little bit of a background history in terms of our mutual evaluation report. Jamaica's second on-site mutual evaluation report or exercise occurred in 2015. And I believe the Minister of Finance clarified that even though the report or the exercise was done in 2015, it took 2 years for the report to be finalized. So it was published in January 2017. Now, a mutual evaluation report is essentially an exercise. It's a really deep diagnostic into your AML CFT framework as a jurisdiction. And it is being evaluated against FATF, which is an international standard setter for anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. And so coming out of that diagnostic, they had 40 standards against which we were evaluated. And as the minister pointed out, we came out not looking very good in 2017, for we are compliant with just only 50% of those recommendations. Now, there are a number of implications for a country where the mutual evaluation report reflects significant deficiencies in their AML-CFT framework. These include, but are not limited to, being placed in the FATF's follow-up process and being required to report on the progress of that jurisdiction in closing the gaps identified in the report. There's also a follow-up assessment after 5 years, during which time the country is expected to substantially address its framework deficiencies by enhancing regulatory and administrative frameworks. But that's just the top line. The reality is that when a country is in that enhanced follow-up process, its reputation globally is tarnished. And it means that other jurisdictions and other financial institutions in other jurisdictions, to be more specific, have to take enhanced due diligence processes before they approve transactions with our country. And what does that mean practically? It means that if we have a returning resident who is getting their pension from England, and that pension is being transferred from a bank in England to a bank in Jamaica, rather than receiving those funds in 3 days, she or he will have to perhaps wait a few weeks because of the back and forth between those two financial institutions. The satisfaction that, in fact, that overseas financial institution is treating with an entity that is run in a sound manner and does not bring that overseas institution into disrepute. So it has dire effects, and I think in Jamaica's case, the impact has been shrouded in a number of other existential crises that Jamaica has faced. The COVID pandemic, the recent inflationary pressures that we've been under. So all of those things have sort of kind of created somewhat of noise in terms of what the direct impact of Jamaica being on the grey list has been. But from where I sit, and by reading the complaints that I get from customers of banks, oftentimes when I look into it, I realize that the root cause of several of these have to do with this exact issue of being grey listed. This has also had consequential implications on Jamaica's inclusion on other lists. And in this context, we're not talking about the Dean's List. We're talking about the EU and the UK list of third states which pose money laundering and terrorism financing risks, obviously to those jurisdictions. And of course, that is a separate process which has its own mechanisms to treat with for how you get out of those processes. So coming out from the FATF grey list process does not automatically mean that you are removed from these other lists. And so you have that compounding effect of the pressure to be able to demonstrate, not just to yourself, which of course the minister was very clear articulating this morning, that ultimately speaking, this is about Jamaica and ensuring that as Jamaicans we feel comfortable going about our businesses in a context which is safe. It also poses a challenge in terms of our foreign relationships with partners, especially in the context of Jamaica being an extremely open economy. So what are some of these? I've mentioned some of them, in terms of the implications, loss of correspondent banking services or limitations in the access to overseas correspondent banking services. International banks required to do enhanced due diligence on Jamaican financial institutions before they approve a transaction. And of course, the negative impact on Jamaica's reputation. Consequent upon the MER and Jamaica also meeting the FATF criteria for enhanced follow-up, Jamaica was advanced into the ICRG enhanced monitoring and what is also proverbially called the grey listing process in February of 2020. As a result of being on that grey list and being added to the European Union's list, as well as being on the UK list in 2021, we had to start a process of addressing the action plan which was presented to us by FATF to complete on 13 key deliverables to demonstrate that we intended to close critical deficiencies in our architecture within a short period of time. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that time elapsed in February of 2022. So having been put on that enhanced process in May 2020, the period for demonstrating that we had satisfied those actions expired in February 2022. And out of the 13 action items at that time, Jamaica had only completed 3 or 4 of those items at that time. Subsequent to that, of course, we have made substantial progress, closing out a number of those action items, and I will spend a little time towards the end of this articulating some of the progress we have made there. So what have we been doing since 2017? The member of the public would have a good reason to ask that question. Well, there has been the passage of a number of legislative amendments to a raft of legislation, including the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Terrorism Prevention Act, the UNSCRIA, and other regulations were enacted or amended to make them fit for purpose and able to meet the criteria set out under the FATF recommendations. We have also implemented measures to ensure faster communication of UN designations for better monitoring of AML CFT sanctions regimes of the FIs. And what that basically means is that when someone is designated by the UN as being a person of interest or a terrorist, as defined under those laws, then immediately within 24 hours, all licensees across the system under each of the competent authorities have to be notified They have an obligation to check their databases and their operating systems to see if they are facilitating transactions on behalf of those persons, and then they have an obligation under law to report that to the FID. And all of that needs to happen in 24 hours. Completing a more comprehensive NRA using a well-known methodology that we use the World Bank tool. And I just want to pause at this point and indicate that what we have achieved has not been only achieved solely as a function of what's been happening local authorities, but we have received a lot of technical support from the IMF, from the EU, from other parties over that period. So that's just a footnote, but an important one, I believe. So we, in order to complete this comprehensive national risk assessment, we pulled over someone from the private sector, Dr. Dana Dixon. She was working at Jamaica National at the time, and we pulled her over to help drive that process of delivering for us a very comprehensive and robust national risk assessment. And I won't get into that. I know we have presenters that will delve deep into that. But let's just say, Jamaicans say, fish come from river bottom, and you can complete the rest of the phrase. So to have someone of her stature and her knowledge of the financial system come and assist us in that way is something that I think at the Bank of Jamaica we are eternally grateful for that, and for the team that was assembled to help us deliver on this national risk assessment. Excellent example of collaboration. Thank you for that, Selvin. So, enhancing the level of coordination and cooperation and collaboration between law enforcement agencies, prosecutor's office, as well as law enforcement, other competent authorities. And when we talk about competent authorities, we're talking about the Bank of Jamaica, we're talking about the FSC, we're talking about the DCFS, we're talking about the BGLC, the Real Estate Board, and the list goes on. And so over the last 5 years, we have been meeting, rolling up our sleeves, and really trying to figure out how do we not just meet the FATF recommendations, but how do we, in some instances, try to exceed the FATF recommendations. And I think in large part, we have been able to do so. I can say that because we have moved from a compliance rate of 50% of the recommendations to a compliance rate of 80% of the recommendations. And that was achieved as a result of significant effort across all legal law enforcement, competent authorities, the DPP's department, ministries department across government, sitting down and trying to figure out how do we collaborate, how do we execute, and how do we exceed expectations. So please, one more round of applause for that entire team of persons that have been working assiduously on this while doing their full-time jobs, I'd like to also add. But we're not satisfied with 33 out of 40. We're not satisfied with 35 out of 40. And we're not satisfied with 39 out of 40. We are going to make that 40, all 40. And if they add another one, we'll make that one too. All right, so additionally, though Jamaica's action plan with the FATF expired in February 22, as I said earlier, 9 of the 13 action items have been addressed or largely addressed as of today. The completion of Jamaica's national risk assessment, I've spoken about that. The implementation of legal frameworks to bring microfinance entities and trust and corporate service providers under the AML-CFT framework. That is significant effort has gone into that, and I think we have made great strides there. Implementation of the risk-based approach for designated non-financial institutions. So we're talking about taking a risk-based approach for betting, gaming, and casino activities that occur in our jurisdiction, taking a risk-based approach to high-risk sectors such as car dealers, high-risk sectors such as real estate developers. Those are all areas where we're trying to tighten up on how we go about supervising these sectors. The passage of regulations to enhance our oversight of the charities sector in Jamaica, ensuring that non-profit organizations are not being used as vehicles to clean dirty money. And the thing about criminals, they will always find the most, pardon the expression, angelic forms to perpetrate their crimes, because of course they know that that is where persons are least expecting that such crimes would be taking place. But we are tightening up in terms of our oversight there, and I know the head of the DCFS is here with us this morning, and he has been leading that charge. And of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? So unless you're getting prosecutions, unless you're confiscating property, and unless people are going to prison because of their activities which are breaking laws which are well established, then all of this effort that I've mentioned before comes to naught. And I'm happy to say that the statistics have been showing that we are finding the criminals, we are putting the criminals away, and we are confiscating the ill-gotten gains in such a way that they will not get the benefit of the use of those properties or assets. Let's use a general term. So what do we have left to do? We have legislative amendments to the Companies Act to address our beneficial ownership framework. This is critical because as a supervisor, you need to know who the ultimate beneficial owner of any asset that's being managed by a licensee is. You cannot be effective unless you know who that ultimate person is. And so we are putting in place are enhancing, because we already have a legislation. The Companies Office already has a legislation that mandates the keeping of beneficial ownership information, to be clear. But what we're doing here in the amendment, or what is being proposed, let me be careful with my language, what is being proposed and will be considered by Parliament is that the threshold for reporting on beneficial ownership information will drop from 40-odd% ownership to 20-odd% ownership. So it means that once a wider pool of persons will be pulled in to that particular database. And then the important thing would be to ensure that competent authorities have access to that database so that when they're doing their fit and proper assessments, when they're doing their assessments of whether or not to grant a contract to a particular party, all that information can be accessed and better informed supervisory decisions can be made. The licensing of TCSPs under the new legislative regime and the implementation of the risk-based approach to that sector, and then the matter of bringing legal professionals fully under the AML-CFT framework is work that is all being advanced, and I won't speak too much about bringing the lawyers under the framework because I think both ministers spoke to that quite eloquently earlier this morning. So what have we learned? As shared earlier, the greylisting process is a grave process, and it is a costly process for the country. Prioritizing the legislative agenda, given the large amount of other legislative matters that have to be passed through Parliament, has been extremely challenging. And of course, the fact that we have been able to amend so many laws in so few years is nothing but a testament of a lot of dedicated effort on the part of those who draft laws. The process has also taught us the importance of cross-sector risk assessment, and I want to put a plug here for the use of technology. I believe that as supervisors, we have to understand that the persons that we're supervising, they themselves are leveraging technology. And we have to understand that the criminals are also leveraging technology. So as competent authorities, we have to lean to use supervisory technology to give us the insights to, one, understand how well our licensees are managing risks. Do they have the systems in place to detect fraud when it is occurring? Do they have the systems in place to identify specific typologies? Do they have the systems in place to be able to investigate those and make the suspicious transaction reports to the FID? But not just that. When the FID gets that information, there's also another process where they have to leverage that information to do their investigations. And so we need to use technology, including artificial intelligence, to help us as supervisors to tell our licensees, this is what makes an STR effective. This is what makes an STR useless, because there's no point in the FID getting information that they cannot act on. And then there's no point in the DPP getting a brief that does not allow them to bring to conviction those who have been involved in money laundering or terrorism financing. So we have to leverage technology is one of the key lessons that I believe we have learned. Fortunately for you, I only have 3 minutes left. So I'll try to skip to the good part. So more collaboration between the FID, law enforcement, the DPP, competent authorities, and licensees is extremely critical. We have to find a way to understand the risks that exist in our system, communicate that risk so that licensees can create their internal control environment in such a way that they can detect when these risks are popping up. And then they're in a position to make the suspicious transaction reports to law enforcement, to the FID, so that if they're taking a zero tolerance approach, then those reports can be acted on by the relevant authorities. We also need to formalize the National Risk Assessment Program by giving NAMLAC, which is this committee of competent authorities that sits and discusses and plans and strategizes around how do we detect and how do we become more effective in our pursuit to ensure that our system remains safe and sound. We have to find a way to create stronger institutions, and that one of those institutions is NAMLAC, codifying NAMLAC in law and making sure that there is a legal obligation to complete a national risk assessment, I believe is a very important step that we need to take as a jurisdiction. We need to understand that this is not something that we can do between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. It has to be something that we're doing from 8:30 all the way through, and we're all committed to that process. So we have to build that infrastructure that allows us to execute on that on an ongoing basis. We also need to ensure that we are, as I would have mentioned earlier, leveraging technology and using that technology across competent authorities so that we can get economies of scale in terms of what we're seeing. There's no point in, for example, one competent authority figuring out that there's a weakness in the system and then putting in the measures to close that off, and then the criminals just move to another sector. You know, that's just common sense tells you that that is just not an efficient way to operate. So, as I close, as we continuously try to understand our exposures to money laundering, terrorism financing, and proliferation risks, we have to proactively manage and drive the process at a national level and preemptively engage all stakeholders. This involves a continuous review of our legislation to ensure that it's fit for purpose across all sectors. A law that is written in 2010 may not be relevant in 2023. Bringing Jamaica into compliance with all FATF 40 recommendations and maintaining this standing even as FATF modifies what it considers largely compliant or compliant. Ensuring the ongoing identification of framework gaps and seeking to proactively address those gaps in the context of NAMLAC. And then ensuring that all stakeholders that are charged legally with the responsibility of ensuring that our jurisdiction remains strong and robust against money laundering and terrorism financing, that they are properly coordinating and learning from each other as we work together to make Jamaica safe and sound, and a place where people can have confidence that when they invest, or whether they deposit, or whether they engage in a transaction, that in fact they are getting a good deal. I trust that you have found this session fruitful, and you'll be able to leverage this information to better understand the importance of widening the use of POCA through collaboration. Thank you.